Welcome to the Lighthouse Financial Advisors Money Over 50 podcast with Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue. This information is general in nature and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation or needs. Therefore, you should consider whether the information is appropriate for you and your personal circumstances. If you require personal advice, please contact Lighthouse Financial Advisors. Here are your hosts, Dallas Davison and Michael Hogue.
The topic for today's discussion is what super fund should I be in? So Dallas, what super fund should I be in?
Thanks, Michael. I guess it's a bit of a non-answer when people ask us this, because usually we kind of fold them off to some degree and don't answer that question straight off the bat, because the reality is that while it is a decision that does need to be made, it's far down the list of questions that you should be asking. Usually the reason, I guess, people are asking that question, what they really want to know is what fund should I be using that's going to get me the best return? And I guess that's kind of why there's a problem with that, is that getting the best return is not necessarily the job of the superannuation provider that you use. So as that example, if you're invested with Sunsuper in their balanced option versus Host Plus in their balanced option versus Colonial First State in their balanced option, your return you get is going to be very similar. So what people are, I think, trying to work out by asking this question and what they're actually asking are kind of two different things. So that's sort of normally the first thing before we get into the nuts and bolts of what are the different components of that and what fund should someone be in and how to decide that. It's really about, the first thing about that question is realising that it probably isn't going to make the difference that you think it is. I guess one of the main questions that we see a lot of, or that we ask of our clients, or that we work through with our clients to determine, is what people are asking about with investment returns. The biggest driver of those investment returns is going to be two parts, which is asset allocation and behavioural management. So asset allocation simply means what asset classes should I be invested in. So what percentage of my super balance should be invested into cash, property, shares, those types of things. So making the right decision there is the key point that is going to determine the returns that you get, and that is really the asset classes you should be invested in are dependent completely on your age and stage, how far out from retirement you are, what your retirement goals are, all of those types of things. And then the second driver of that is behaviour management. So I can't tell you which fund you should be invested into or which asset classes you should be invested into until we know how you're going to behave in times of stress, when markets are up, when markets are down. So I guess to fold the question off initially is that I would say that's probably not the key driver of your returns. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, the last thing that we think you should look at is whether your fund has Colonial First State on the statement, or if it's Q Super, if it's Sunsuper.
Yeah.
There are filters that we apply to all superannuation funds, and really deciding which fund it is ultimately is certainly way down the list. So the rate of return is very important, of course, because with too low of a rate of return, you're not going to get to where you need to be. With too high of a rate of return, it may be too volatile and you may not be able to handle that volatility. There's quite a few questions beforehand.
I think that's, as an analogy I use there, is that the super fund that you should be in is similar to what home loan should I have, or which bank should I use my home loan. In reality, most banks are going to be very similar in their offerings, and that's just through market forces, is that they're all going to offer something similar for a similar price or for a similar cost. The bigger question, rather than what type of home loan should I have, is how expensive of a house should I live in? What payments should I be making off the loan? All of those types of things are going to have a bigger determinant on your long-term outcomes than whether you've got a home loan through NAB or CBA or whoever. So I think of it in a similar way with your super fund, where it is a decision that needs to be made down the track, but there are a lot of other questions that need to be answered that are going to have a bigger impact than your choice of fund. So as an example, is superannuation, and this is more for people who are getting close to retirement, is superannuation the right ownership structure to have my retirement savings in? So should I be worried about the money that's in there, or should I be worried about the money that's outside of superannuation? What types and amounts of contributions should I be making to superannuation? Am I on track to have enough to retire? What should my expectations for my retirement income be? All of those kinds of things I think of as more important or more relevant for most of the people that we see walking in the door, rather than necessarily, as you say, whether their super fund has Q Super or Claim First State on the front of it. The answer to those questions is going to be a bigger driver of their lifestyle in retirement.
Absolutely. I mean, these are the strategic levers that we refer to as being able to that our clients are able to be to pull on to basically get them to where they need to be, and certainly the least important I guess factor is what the name of the fund is. If it's Q Super or Sun Super or MLC or Colonial First State, I mean, it does have a bearing. But certainly. Yeah, it's
so now that we've just spent 5 minutes canning the whole premise of this discussion and how important it is, as you say, it is still a decision that needs to be made, and some of the factors that we look at, as you said, Mike, we have a filter that you look through, is that most funds can offer something similar, and it is really just a matter of filtering down through those things and going, what's most suitable for the person asking that question. So at the very start, you've got what type of fund are we going to choose here? Is it going to be a retail fund, an industry fund, or a self-managed super fund? Some of the other options that will determine what the right fund is. Some employers have extra benefits that they will offer for certain funds. This is going away a bit more, I find, with a lot of the super funds that I'm looking at, especially industry funds, where it used to be that Q Super was a great fund, because if you were a Queensland government employee, you had to pay into Q Super to get your employer to make top-up contributions into there as well. Now that's actually just recently changed, and you can get those top-up contributions into any fund, but there are still employers out there that will say that if you only you will only get extra contributions, for example, if you pay into this fund. Or another example is that there are employers that will pay insurance premiums into a certain fund. So those tend to be a bit of a laydown misere, because if someone's going to give you extra contributions to go into a fund, usually that's going to be far and away a bigger driver of your outcomes over long term than necessarily. There's not going to be a better fund out there than the one that gives you the extra contributions.
Investment options is important as well.
Yep.
So most funds, so most larger funds, Sun Super, we keep saying Sun Super and Q Super and all those, because I mean the ones that we commonly see and the ones you're probably most familiar with, but they all have a range of different investment strategies, and generally speaking, that would suit more than 99% of people, the range of investment strategies. So I mean, investment options is important, but most of the bigger funds do have a great range of that.
And that ties into, as I was saying, about the home loan analogy there, is that there's normally not going to be a super fund that you can go into that's going to get you some U-Butte return that is going to outperform the rest of the market. It's just long-term statistically not going to happen. So it's really about going, the investment options that I want to be in that are most suitable for me, based on the age that I'm at, the stage I'm at leading up to retirement, what asset classes I need to be in. But as you say, it's like a CBA home loan versus a NAB home loan. Once you've determined the amount of the loan and the type of loan, the cost of that and the outcome is going to be very similar. So, and that ties into the next part of that, which is one of the other factors that determine these funds is those fees. So as I say, as you just said about Sun Super is the example we used. Most of the time, if you're with a Sun Super or a Q Super or whoever, they will have many of the investment options that we would recommend for a lot of people leading up to retirement, and the fees that they're going to charge for that are very competitive. So it's really a matter of working backwards into those fees and going, what do I need to be invested into? What's the best way for me to have my super balance invested? And then what are the costs that these funds are going to charge me to have that?
It's an interesting one. Fees definitely do make a huge difference. So, saving of 0.5% in fees over the last 10 years of your working life does add up generally to be tens of thousands of dollars of extra fund that you have in your superannuation, just through savings of fees. So some of not all industry funds are really low cost. Now they have low cost options in their suite of investment options generally, but the default option, which means you haven't made a choice as to where you want your money invested, they put you into the default option. Some of those fees have pushed up in recent times. So it's not necessarily leave that fund whole as bowlers, but to definitely have a look at the investment options in there, and you can change to a lower cost strategy, assuming of course that it suits your objectives.
And that I guess ties into sort of the last factor that I can sort of think of off my head here, which is the service that you get or the administration offered by those funds. So there are, as you get closer to retirement, there are certain things that you can do. One of those, once you've met a condition of release, is move into pension phase. So you may have heard this before, where you can actually change from having an earnings tax of 15% on that money to an earnings tax of 0%. So it can be really handy to be invested in a super fund that allows you to transfer that money straight across to pension phase as soon as you're eligible. So as we've said, that can make a huge difference in tax savings over time. So that will be a big determinant of whether your fund is suitable, is do they have an offering where you can actually move into that pension phase, because that's going to make a big difference. So I guess those are the factors. They're not generally that exciting, and they're probably not that commonly known to most people. We talk to people about going, where's your superannuation invested at the moment, and usually they'll be able to tell us the name of the fund, but the investment options they're not sure about, the fees attached to that they're not sure about. So that's a part of what we look at generally with all of our new clients, is to make sure that firstly, where should that money be invested in terms of the asset classes that are most suitable, and then which fund is actually most appropriate for them. Where we see this sort of gone wrong a bit is to pick on the barefoot investor here. For anyone who's read the book, one of the key determinants that if I see someone book an appointment and they've got 2 lots of Host Plus balanced option super funds and an ING bank account, I know they've read the Barefoot Investor, which is great because it normally means that they're taking control of their budget and they're doing all those sorts of things. Where it's kind of only half a job though is that the only focus has been on move to Host Plus balanced option because it's low cost, or I'm not sure what the main impetus is for that, but it's kind of just, that's a one-off decision to move across to there, and generally there hasn't been the level of thought given that there needs to be as to whether the asset allocation is appropriate. So if you've got a 17-year-old who's moved across to the Host Plus balanced option, it's not going to be, their needs are going to be very different to a 63-year-old who's a year out from retirement, or a 52-year-old who's accumulating as much as they can over the last 10 years. So as you say, those are the sorts of things that need to be thought about more so than moving to a certain fund. Is the asset allocation appropriate? Before you make any decisions about rolling out of a super fund into another one, you need to be making sure that you're not losing insurances that can't be replaced. I mean, we've seen this a lot where people make a decision combine all their super funds, which again, it's good to see people taking control of their super and that kind of thing. The downside is sometimes they are losing insurances by doing those rollovers that they just can't replace elsewhere. As you said, there's generally some employers can offer benefits to use a certain fund. So again, it makes sense to pick up as much of that as you can. There's not often that you get a free lunch, so it's good to use that. Whether there's a lower cost option, again, the costs of all of these funds change over time as well, and that's something, like I say, it's not a matter of make a decision once. It's not that super fund is going to be the best super fund forever. It's dependent on what is suitable for you where you are right now. And as you say, another one that we see that it's kind of missing the point by focusing on which fund it should be in is what contributions should people be making. There's a lot of tax savings that can be picked up by making certain types of contributions, that if you're just focused on the choice of fund and which fund you're using, you're not going to be taking advantage of all those things.
It's a good point. I think oftentimes people think the magic bullet is choosing this superannuation fund, and that's all they need to do. We know from experience that there's far more to be gained from freeing up $10,000 or $20,000 from the family budget that's going on wasted things and contributing that to your superannuation fund. Looking at if you can claim a tax deduction for it, which creates an arbitrage usually where you're saving 34.5% tax, for example, and you're paying only 15% tax on that money going into superannuation. Choosing an investment strategy or investment strategies inside that particular fund that may be higher growth and may be required actually to help that person to get to where they need to be. So there's certainly no magic bullet in that, and I think people are often when new clients come to us, it's usually by the third appointment that they ask us, what super fund should we be in? And it's almost an afterthought for us because it's those types of strategies that we really get enjoyment out of, and really the levers that they need to pull to actually get them to where they need to be.
I think you make a good point there. That phrase, magic bullet, is that it would be fantastic if there was a fund that you could just go roll over into this fund. It will make all your wildest dreams come true. It will get you the return you need. There will be no volatility. You don't have to give anything up. That would be fantastic if that were the case. And I think for a lot of people, it takes, like you say, generally by the third appointment, people realise that the fund that you actually use is really an afterthought there. It's all of those other things that are going to